Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in. This is Brian Carroll, aka the Kickin' Chicken, and we're coming to you today from Shooter's Billiards in Southington, Connecticut, one of the best old school style pool rooms you'll ever see. First, I would like to offer a big thank you to Shooter's room owner Sal Conti for hosting this, as well as his shared interest in preserving some of pool's very interesting and colorful history. I will assure everyone that today's guest has not only had a front row seat to a fair amount of it, but has in fact become part of pool's colorful history himself. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome legendary road hustler and all-around good guy, Mr. Bobby Hunt. To give people a little background, please tell us where you grew up, approximately when that was, and maybe a little bit about your first exposure to pool.
Well, I grew up in Guilford, Connecticut, and I learned to play pool. A friend of mine had a table on their porch, and I couldn't have more than 10 or 11, and I remember playing with them out there for nickels and dimes for our change from the store, and I liked it right from the start. But I started playing a lot probably when I was about 13, in 8th grade, I remember. We had a local rec center, and there were a lot of really good young players in that area in our area back then. But by the time I was 14, 15, I was hooked. I knew I was going to do that. I stopped everything else. I just wanted to be playing pool. Then I went out to California in 1966. Yeah, I went out. I stayed out there for a year, and I was around real pool rooms, not recreation centers, and I was learning how to gamble, and I was watching the older players. The best player was a guy named Ernie Lorelli, I'm sorry, and he was the best player in the area at the time. But I got to see people, that became, Ronnie Allen, people like that. I was staying in San Bernardino, and I'd see people like that. They were all young at the time, and I was hooked. I started making little day trips. I thought I was a pool hustler. And we'd get on my Honda 90, my partner and I. We'd drive over to Riverside, and there were so many pool rooms back in the 60s, and everybody thought they could play. And we would ride around my one-piece queue on my Honda 90 looking for action, but I had to be home, at nighttime. And, after that, I came back to Connecticut. I was a pretty good player now. I was about 17, and I was playing really well. So the older guys started taking me to New Haven and play older people, and they'd probably give me about $1 an hour. Well, I was just happy I was in action. But then I went into service after that. Then I went to college a little bit.
Were you drafted, or did you enlist?
I enlisted. A couple of my friends had enlisted in the Marines, and they talked me into joining and said we were going to have a lot of fun together, and it didn't work out the way they promised.
So the fun they were talking about, I guess it wasn't Vietnam. That's where you ended up.
No,
Yeah?
it's just the recruiters in New Haven lied to us about everything. We were going to have our own apartment. I mean, we were stupid. Yeah, we were just young. I was 17 years old. I was barely going to school, and I was hanging around the bowling alley gambling all the time, and it seemed like an adventure. And I'm glad I did it. I mean, it was the best thing I ever did for my young life. And I was
laying it out pretty thick.
I was in the Marines.
Yep.
So they were tougher.
What was it like when you came back from the war?
What do you mean? What was it like? The country?
Yeah, just the reception and the climate for pool, all that.
Well, the reception wasn't great when we came home. We just didn't talk about it. But pool, I didn't really start playing a lot. I came home in 1970, and actually, coincidentally, it was 50 years ago today I got out of Vietnam. I came home. I remember. I went back to school for a year. Then I tried to go to college, but I was starting to play pretty good. This was around 1972. And I knew I wasn't going to work. I knew I was going to try to make it as a pool player. So by 73, I was playing full time. And there was so much action in Connecticut, everywhere in the 70s. But Milford Rec is where I was playing. And it was every single day. And I was getting good, very quickly.
Now, you and I, over the years, we discovered that we had a friend in common, a guy that that used to take you around, Paulie Kerry from New Haven, and I happened to work across the street from his restaurant, and he found out that I played pool, and he was taking me around a little bit, and he lost interest in me, but apparently he stayed on with you for a while longer, and you had a nice relationship with him. And tell us a little bit about him and his brother and the goings-on with those fellows over at the Milford Rec.
Well, Milford Rec was a great pool room for 20 years. There was action every day, every night. Paulie, the man you're talking about, discovered me if anybody did. He owned a bar in downtown New Haven. He would feed me when I needed it. He'd tell me who to play. You know, he didn't back me, but he would loan. You know, he took part of my bet, but he liked young pool players. And in fact, when the first time I went in there, he was the first person I played. And I knew how to play pool, but I didn't know all the rules. Like, we were playing push-out back then. So I went in, and I remember I ran the first rack on Paulie, thought I was stealing. Then he beat me about 10 in a row and broke me. I stayed away about 6 months, but next time I came in, I'd become a better player. You know, I was playing every day, but Paulie was very sharp, and he was an old gangster. His whole family were. And he would tell me, you know, how to ask for weight and explain to me, you know, there's a lot of nuances in pool. You know, it's a lot more than just pocketing balls if you want to make money. You know, that's something young players could. It's different now.
I know you had a couple of early road trips with our friend Bruce DeFranza. How did you guys meet, and where did you go?
We actually met right here. I came here in, I don't know what year it would have been, 1980 or 81, I think. And I came in here with a friend of ours, Paul Dobratz, and I saw Bruce playing, and at the time, my girlfriend saw him and said, we saw him a few weeks earlier in New London. He lost some money to a friend of ours. So I asked Bruce to play, and we played right on the front table here. And it was in the summertime, and I didn't play much in the summers back then. But we played for a while, and I broke even. So we said we'll play again in a few days. Well, I hit some balls over the next few days, and I came back, and I did a little better that time. So we gambled together a few times, and then I was getting better. We were becoming better friends. We sort of stopped gambling, and I started inviting him, telling him I was going places. I took him to North Carolina the first time. He had never left Connecticut. And we get into North Carolina, and he thought there was a lot of action here, but it was nothing like what he saw. We get into Greensboro, it's about 3 in the morning. We go by the pool room. There's 10 guys gambling. They're betting thousands of dollars. And I said to Bruce, we got to get a room. I couldn't get him out of there for 12 hours. He had never seen action like that. And we went down there a few times together, and we stay a week or two at a time. I always had kids, so I'd come home. You know.
Was he even back then, was he always such a big presence and so congenial?
He was a great guy to be your friend with. He was nice to have with me, because I remember playing a guy one day, and I had a little problem. He was a really big guy, and I was spotting him a lot. We had a problem, and he got right on top of my face, came right up on me, and I go, Bruce. I stepped back, and the problem went away. He was good to be with. Well,
He had that intimidation factor.
oh, he did, and he used it well. And he was a good player too. You know, we spent a lot of time together. And then a friend of ours, Kenny, you know, and there were a lot of pool players in Connecticut back in those days.
The Kenny you're referring to is Kenny Wellman.
Yes.
So tell us, anybody unfamiliar with Kenny Wellman, what was his story?
Kenny was a really, really good pool player, but he looked so goofy. I mean, he looked like he couldn't play. And we would go places. Before I ever met Bruce, I knew Kenny a good 8 or 9 years before I met Bruce. So Kenny and I would go a lot of places together. I'm trying to remember what year it would have been, through the late 70s, as we were both getting better and better. But nobody ever wanted to play me, you know. Kenny, they would jump on him. And he looked goofy. He'd twist his head and he'd grit his teeth. He could barely draw the cue ball, but he just never missed. You know, he really could. So he made all the money because nobody wanted to play me. and that was fine. But we were. He was a good friend for a long time. He was so goofy.
They pointed out that he had a mouth like a rabbit.
They called him a rabbit. Sometimes he'd twist his head and grit his teeth, and if it was quiet, you could hear his teeth grinding. Yeah. And he wore a bandana, but he was a really good pool player.
A while back, there was a guy on AZ Billiards named Richie Balto, he called himself, and he had posted a really high praise, a compliment aimed at you. Do you remember playing this guy?
Yes, I do. Richie was a great guy. I showed up in Baltimore. I was in town less than an hour, and I knew who I wanted to play. I went in there, where he played in Dundalk, which is a suburb. And we started playing. We started 100 a game. Within an hour, we're betting 250 a rack, and he wanted to bet 500 a game. He was a stand-up guy. He bet his own money. He staked people. I have only good things to say about Richie.
How was the climate down there for gambling in Baltimore?
In my opinion, in the early 80s, there wasn't a better city I'd ever been to. There were 25 bars where everybody was playing, and then when the bars closed, there were another 25 pool rooms open, most of them all night, and everybody was gambling down there. I've never seen as much action in my life. I couldn't keep up with it. Nobody could. And you'd run into players from all over the country in that area back in the early 80s.
So I know under the tutelage of Ed O'Connell, you weren't chasing after champions to get them to the table to play. There's usually not an upside to that, as you explained it to me before. If you beat them, nobody wants to play you, and if you lose to them, you're a loser. So, but with that understood, I'd like to go over a few guys' names that you may have had some action with, or perhaps just know some interesting aspects about these guys. How about Steve Miserak?
I played Steve one time in an exhibition. I remember he broke. I ran the first 18. I had an easy throw shot, and my mind froze. I didn't know what to do, and hit it the wrong way, and he ran about 125 and out. And that was my one time with playing Steve. Steve bet on me a couple times, later on as I got better. But he's the best straight pool player I ever saw.
How about Kim Davenport?
Well, I never played Kim. Excuse me. But I ran into him when I was out in San Francisco, San Jose. I went over to Sacramento where he was playing, and I had beaten somebody in the pool room. So I was sitting around afterwards with kind of like a bleacher seating. I'm looking down, and Davenport comes in, and he's hitting balls on one of the tables. So I'm watching him. Kim's a great player. So as I'm watching him, somebody else walks over to me and said, "Do you want to play Davenport?" I said, "Oh, no, I can't beat him." And I wouldn't beat him anyhow. And I said, "There's no upside. Either you lose money or you lose action." So I said, "No, I can't play him." He said, "What if he gives you the 6-ball?" I said, "Well, I guess if he gives me the 6-ball, I would have to try to play some." So he walked back down to Davenport, and he tells Kim that I'll play some with a 6. Davenport looks up at me, and I must have been hitting balls because he looked over at me. All he did was shake his head. So as far as I was concerned, that was the end of it. I ran into him 2 weeks later. I'm getting ready to come back to Connecticut. So now there's no reason, sneaking around anymore. So I'm going to play this tournament. I'm hitting balls. Davenport walks back past me. We have never spoken. He looked at me. I hit a few. He says, "I never spot left-handed strangers." And I thought that was a great line, But he's a great player.
And as we've discussed before, for whatever reason, lefties sure look good at the table.
Yeah, I think so.
Seem to, yeah, it's true. I know you really like this next guy's game. Tell me what you know about St. Louis Louie Roberts.
Well, he was a character, I'll say that. He was a great player. He was total offense. And I never played him, but I have a great line one day. I was somewhere in North Carolina. I come walking out of the pool room, and I'm with a friend of mine, Kenny Wellman from Connecticut. And we see Louie Roberts sitting in his car. And we walk by Louie, and Kenny and Louie are kind of friendly. They're talking a little bit. And Louie looks up at us. He says, "I'm 1,000 miles from home. I got 10 cents in my pocket. I have no gas in the car, and there's no place I'd rather be." And I said, that was perfect for a pool player. He was happy. He was flat busted. but he was a monster when he was right.
I heard he had one heck of an Elvis Presley impersonation.
I heard. I never saw it.
Yeah, I heard
the
he was
same
fantastic
thing.
at it.
He was a great player. He was a character. But
Now,
know,
were you a witness to him when he was playing Keith McCready?
No, I never saw him.
Oh, okay.
I never saw him play. I heard the story about when he played Keith.
Yeah.
They were supposedly they were playing. It was either a 10 ahead or a race to 10. This is just third hand. I heard it.
Yeah.
Said Keith broke and ran the whole set, and said Louie didn't say a word. He paid him, unscrewed his cue, and he's walking out the door. And Keith was yelling, Louie, come back, come on, we can adjust. And Louie said, I'm embarrassed to ask for what I need to play you, and I'm afraid you might give it to me. So I thought that
That's
was
another great line.
Yeah,
Huh? Wow.
He was a character in pool.
Bob, how about Jimmy Reid? You ever cross paths with him?
We played one time. I was in New Jersey and I'd beaten somebody, and there was a guy named Phil, and I can't remember his last name. He had a wife that played pretty good. He said he would take me up into Queens, on Queens Boulevard. I forgot the name of the queue. It was a famous pool room, a huge pool room, like 60, 70 tables. And he said, I know some people looking to what you could play. So I didn't know Phil, but I let him steer me over there. So we drive up to Golden Q, that's what it was called, on Queens Boulevard.
Oh, yeah.
So we go in there, and there's a guy hitting balls with a house cue. So this guy, Phil, who was my new friend, he said, that guy's looking to play. So I went over and asked him to play. And he said, sure. So back then we played by the game. We didn't play very often, we played races. So we started playing $20 a game, and I didn't know who he was at all. We started playing 20 a game. After a little while, he says, you want to bet 40? I said, why don't we just bet 50? And it was a mistake. After that, he beat me pretty easily, and I didn't know who he was. But when we quit, he unscrewed his cue stick. I had never seen a two-piece house cue. And next morning I called Gus Zambodi, had to make me one. But then I found out shortly after that I had played Jimmy Reid, and I ran into him years later somewhere. He said, I was the only one in New York who showed him any gamble. Everybody else was trying to steal. But that was my one experience with Jimmy.
Yeah, well, he was a heck of a player.
Oh,
was.
He just won the U.S. Open, too.
Yeah, and a good guy.
Great player.
How about Cecil Tugwell?
I played Cecil. He came to Connecticut, I don't know what year. It must have been early 80s. I was starting to play pretty good. And he came to Connecticut, and he got in some trouble in New London. So he had to stay in Connecticut for almost a year. At the time, he was considered one of the best one-pocket players in the country. And he played other games too, but he was a champion at one pocket. So I played him when he first got here, and he gave me 9-7. And he beat me kind of like I think it was like 9-0, 9-0, 9-4, 9-0, 9 something. I somehow won a game. I don't know how I did it. After I won the game, I quit. I knew I couldn't beat this guy. He was great. Well, shortly after that, I don't know what happened. He showed up in the pool room, and I gotta get to remember how it was. His right hand had a bandage on it. He had somehow hurt his right hand. He didn't tell us what happened, and he started playing left-handed. He stayed in that room for must have been close to a year, and just practiced every day, all day long, left-handed. And he made himself quite a player the rest of his life. He was a top player left-handed.
Well, I remember reading about that he went opposite hand because of an injury, and he was one of the top guys. I guess it's on par with what we're seeing John Moore doing, which is to me it's unfathomable. These guys can go opposite hand and then play world speed, but
when
Cecil, it's possible. Yeah.
When Cecil had come to Connecticut, he had some relative, a sister or something in New London, but he'd come to Connecticut. He had a fairly new Mercedes, and he had just come from Detroit. And this is when Detroit, there was so much action going on.
Oh, the rack.
The rack.
Yeah.
He won enough to came up. He had a fairly new Mercedes outside. We had this guy Cliff who hung around the pool room. He was a pimp, and he had a couple of old Cadillacs, like 58, 59, with the big fins. They were really, really
Dramatic.
They really were.
Uh-huh.
And Cecil liked it. He was trying to trade his new Mercedes for one of those pimp cars.
Yeah.
And the guy said, no, I don't want your foreign car. Oh.
Back then, I guess that's all it was, a foreign
It
car.
was a foreign
Yeah,
car.
the '59 Cadillac, that was
had those
the
huge
most
things.
outrageous of the thin cars. Did you have any experience over at West End in West New York?
West End didn't become good yet. I mean, West End Billiards in New Jersey?
Well, I think it's actually New York. It's like right on the line. It's over the Hudson. It might be New Jersey.
No,
I'm
it
not
was
positive.
it was in Elizabeth.
Oh, okay.
But that didn't hit yet. When I was playing a lot, we were playing in Elizabeth in a place, I think it was called the High Q. Mike Ash owned the room. That was a good spot. But it didn't come for, I mean, it had to be the mid-'80s to late '80s by the time the other rooms started getting popular. And I played one tournament there, and I got beat by Joe Frady in the finals, if I recall.
Neptune Joe, yeah.
Yes, he was a great
He was
player.
formidable.
Yeah, very good player.
Another good one in his area was Jack Colavita. Have you played him or you know
I
him?
played 9-ball with him one afternoon.
Yeah.
I loved the way Jack played straight pool. His 9-ball wasn't anything special because that era, you didn't have a lot of good. Those straight pool players didn't have great breaks. You know, most of them just, and Jack was one of them. They didn't hit him very well, but he never missed. But I loved watching him play straight pool. He played the old style where you had to break the balls up 3 or 4 times because they were all tight, you know, locked together. Not like now where the rack breaks much easier. And you'd watch Jack run. He was like a surgeon the way he'd run the ball. He was great. I mean, I don't know why he didn't win world titles because, you know, Alan Hopkins, I heard him say one time, he felt the reason Jack didn't win more titles is Jack always had a job. And he said Jack would come to these tournaments and he had a number in his mind how much money he wanted to make because he wasn't going to work that week. He said once Jack had gotten to about that number, it's like he lost his intensity a little bit, which I thought was interesting. He was a great guy too. And he played good well into his 70s, you know, maybe even 80. I saw him a couple times in Rockaway, New Jersey, and he still played well.
Yeah.
He still looked good too.
Yeah, he was from West Caldwell, New Jersey. That's where he lived.
There was a spot down there in New Jersey in a 25-mile radius. You had 4 or 5 major pool rooms with 10 world champions in this little cluster area between, you know, Metuchen and Elizabeth, and Hopkins had a room like Springbrook or something. And there was Fort Fairlawn where Ray Martin was from. There was a lot of champion players. You know, it was a tough area.
Well, switching gears, I want to get your thoughts on a couple of other random things here. Glove or no glove? I don't think I've ever seen you wear a glove.
No, I probably will never wear one. No, I don't like the feel. I want to feel the wood.
How about low deflection versus old school maple shafts?
Well, actually, I think the low deflection are better. I think, you know, we didn't call it deflection, we called it squirt, and we learned how to play with it. But now you can just pick up a low deflection shaft. You know, when I'm hitting a shot, I don't have to think what's the English going to do. You know, they're all pretty consistent. If I was just starting out in pool, I'd be playing with a low deflection shaft and an extender in the middle of the cue. I think those are, great. I think they're great. At this stage of my life, I'm not going to relearn how to play.
Now, you and I have talked a bit about the carbon fiber shafts and how it's overwhelmingly the favorite for a lot of the big tournaments we see being played. Do you think it's because the players are being sponsored for the most part, or is it really a preference? Because I've seen a couple of guys, when Revo, for instance, first came out, they were using them. It was like seemed like the flavor of the month, and then a few of them, like Josh Filler comes to mind, and a few others, they went right back to. I think they still stuck with low deflection, but they went with the more maple ones. Like a 314, that kind of shaft. Do you think that the carbon fiber is just a little bit of a fad, or do you think that's really?
No, I think it's going to take over.
Yeah.
I think there's so many people making them now. Companies, like you said, Revo was the first one, so it was new, and maybe they were sponsoring their players then. Now you go to Derby City, 3/4 of the field are playing with Revo, or I mean not Revo, carbon fiber. And most of the top players, not all of them, but
Sure.
the best Americans using them, Van Boning. I think I've played with them a little bit. I have one. I think they're great on making, like for me, making long shots. I think they draw. You get more spin with them than I'm used to getting with a maple. My problem is it's cold. It never feels right to me.
Yeah.
But I think they're great, and I think they're going to do away with maple as years go by.
Yep. All right, moving on. Get staked or bet your own?
Well, it seems to be nowadays that most players get staked. But in my era, we always bet our own. You didn't have many backers. And myself, I never understood why somebody who wants to back somebody, you're laying 2-1. And that never made sense to me. But I was always proud of the fact that I always bet my own money. I will let people bet on me, but most of the money has to be mine. This way, if I dog it, you can't accuse me of dumping. If I lost more money than you did, you can't say anything. So
Very true.
that's I always like that.
Get your mixture right or play on the natural?
Well, I guess it depends on who you are. Some awful good players when their mixture was right. We had a great player here in Connecticut, Johnny Vivas, and Donnie Edwards, And when they were right, they were almost unbeatable. Problem is, whatever you do to get to play well, that stuff doesn't last. And then you got to do it again, and eventually, it's like go back into the '80s when cocaine was real popular. They'd come out of the bathroom, people just beat you up for a while. But I always knew if I didn't run out of money, they couldn't win, because eventually it stops working, but they think it is, and they would go off. But it really helps,
Okay, Bob, it's time we can settle this once and for all. Pocket point or titties?
Well, I've always called them titties, but apparently you can't say that on the internet, so now I call them points.
So they're pocket points while on air,
Yes.
and amongst friends, they're going to be titties, I guess. A while back on AZ Billiards, there was a great guy, he called himself Smorgasbord, and he always had the greatest stories. And he told a story, I think it was about a match, I believe it was Louisiana, and what the guys were playing for was the guy's name, one of the opponent's names, and that if he lost, he wouldn't be able to call himself that ever again. And the story was terrific, and why I'm bringing this up is obviously you've been around, you've seen an awful lot. What are some of the strangest things you've seen gambled for?
Well, Larry Lascotti jumps to mind. I remember one night we were in Chicago Billiards, and Larry was playing someone. I don't remember what the game was, but part of the handicap was Larry had to have a tape wrapped around his mouth so he wouldn't stop talking. So Larry goes, "Yeah, I'll do that," but we had to make a hole in the tape for a cigarette. So he played with a cigarette stuck in the hole in his tape. And there was another one with Larry that I didn't see, but I'd heard a lot of. In the early 70s, there was a pool room in, I think it was in Providence, and a tall black man owned it, and he called him Tall Man. And I heard Larry went in there and played, I don't know if he played Tall Man, but he played one guy, and the handicap was Larry had to play stark naked in a pool room with customers. Now, I didn't get that from Larry, but I heard from someone else. They said Larry never missed a ball. And I thought that was a great story.
That's terrific.
He was one of the great characters in pool that
And very missed, I know.
missed every time I think of him.
Can you please provide a visual of the old Chicago Billiards in West Haven, Connecticut? For people that may not have had a chance to go over there.
You mean like entering it?
Yeah, just how,
Well, it was
what was it like inside?
It was upstairs. You had to go through the front door. They had to buzz you in.
Yeah.
And then as you're going up the stairs, there's cameras, so we always knew who was coming in first. And you'd walk upstairs, and as you got to the top, I think there were 6 tables to the left that were where the gambling took place, and then maybe another dozen to the right for regular people. And it was a great pool room for about 2 years. They had a full kitchen. It was action 24 hours a day. You could stop in at 3 or 4 in the morning. I actually had a job back then. I was a mailman for a couple of years. Thankfully, I quit. But I was trying to deliver mail and be in Chicago Billiards all night. So that one day I just had to give up something. But it was a great pool room.
And you gave up the job, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I wasn't. I never cared to work.
So they had accommodations there for guys, road players coming through.
Well, there was a
They could
big
stay over.
There was a big bedroom in the back room where anyone could sleep there. In fact, people would stay for. Danny Basovich must have stayed 6 months. Joe Frady wound up staying at least a year or two. There were a lot of. I think this is a good story. It has to do with Larry Lascotti in this place. So in the back room, people were sleeping on mats and different things. Chucky Altimore was a really good local player at the time. Chucky, I can remember how this happened. Chucky bought a brand new air mattress, and he laid it out nice to sleep on that night. Well, Larry Lascotti beat him gambling, beat him for the air mattress. Larry slept on the bed, but when he woke up in the morning, there was no air in it, and there was a knife buried to the hilt right through the mattress. Now, we don't know if Chucky did it, but somebody stabbed that mattress while Larry was sleeping.
Odds are probably yes.
Probably. It was a great room, I say, for about 2 years, and then it had run its course. And
Yeah.
Also, they built a police department across the street, which I don't think helped any at all.
Yeah. But a big salute to Ralph the Baker. He had something special going on over there.
He was great for pool for those 4 or 5 years. He would sponsor people. He'd have tournaments. We'd be sitting in his pool in the middle of the night, and he'd throw up 300 to have a tournament just so he could watch. Of course, as soon as he went to bed, we just chopped the money up. You know.
Bob, you and I both know a few really promising, skilled players, young guns. Do you have any advice you could offer them that might help them to get to the next level?
Well, one thing I think, if they ever get a chance to watch, get a chance to watch a really good player. Even my whole life, if I knew, like Toby Sweet was in my lifetime, I loved the way he played. I would drive 2 hours if I knew he was playing somebody. Just to watch, you can learn so much without even saying a word. Just if you can get around good players, you have to watch. I also think, if you want to get good at pool, every time you play, you should play for something. Even if it's as simple as a Coca-Cola. There has to be a penalty for losing. And I think that's important. Just hitting balls, I think, is a waste of time if you want to be a pool player. But I'm trying to think what else. Another good thing I think for young players, which most young people do. Anytime you're around table, hit balls all day long if you have to. The Filipinos and Asians are best in the world for a reason. They're always playing. I don't see that with many American players, except maybe Van Boning, maybe. They don't seem to have that drive or desire.
Yeah, I agree. Well, you spent pretty much most of your life trying to stay under the radar, and here you are at 71 finally doing an interview like this. You realize you knocked your action. You're not going to, no more fair games for Bobby, right?
I think we're 20 years past that, Brian.
So Bob, there was a story about a guy in a wheelchair that managed to win a tournament over in Bridgeport. What went on? You were there, or you heard about this?
I wasn't there. I heard it from Tommy Jr. And I don't think he won the tournament, but he beat a friend of ours who was a really good player at the time. Still, he's a better player now. But he had a bit of a temper. And there was also a big handicap involved. So our friend, after he lost, he didn't take it well, and he's arguing with the guy in the wheelchair how he's going to pull him out of the chair and give him a beating right there. Well, he made a mistake of getting too close. And the guy in the wheelchair actually could stand up a little bit. He came out of the chair and grabbed him around the head and pummeled him for a few minutes. And nobody broke the fight up. But
they weren't of the mind to help him out.
no, that's kind of pool's entertaining. And
Yeah.
in fact, I have another story. My has to do with a fight in a pool room, if I can tell it.
Sure.
My son. When my son was in college, he came home one weekend, and it was about midnight, and I was going to Chicago Billiards because that's what I like to do. He was just coming in. I said, Jonathan, do you want to go to the pool room with me tonight? And I said, he was probably 20 years old, 19 or 20 years old. He said, yeah. And he knew some of the pool players because he's been around. So we're in Chicago Billiards that night, and while we're there, a fight breaks out between a friend of ours, George, and Ryan the Thief. So they're rolling around on the ground fighting. No one's breaking the fight up. We're all cheering and laughing because it's entertainment. And my son leaned over to me. He goes, "Dad, are these your friends?" I said, "Yeah, John, they are." And it was a different world than he was used to. But that was my other fighting story.
When did you meet up with Bobby Hunter, the
Bobby-
now famous cue maker? I know he could play some
He's
pretty
also
good
a
pool.
world champion pool player.
Yeah.
Bobby would have come to Connecticut, I think it was around 83 or 84. And he came to New London first time. He wouldn't play me 9-ball. We played one pocket. And we started playing. We discovered we had the same name. So it turned in more of we became friendly very quickly. We laughed and joked. And I think he beat me at one pocket. So then he wound up staying in Connecticut he stayed with me for a couple weeks. But then he stayed here. He got a job at a pool room in East Hartford. And he must have stuck around a year, quite a while. And this would have been in our early 20s, you know. And then one day, my first real road trip, where I left, this had to be, I don't know, 1975 maybe, 76. I got in the car with a friend of mine from Saybrook. We just drive to Michigan, assuming we'll find Bobby when we get there. And we did. And we went on a road trip. We went out as far, we got to, we went to Las Vegas, and we ran out of money in Tucson. And we only lost one time to Grady Matthews. But we didn't know how to handle money yet. We didn't know how to manage, but we had fun, and I still have some of the memories. But we were gone about 3 weeks, and we didn't know what we were doing, but we both could play, you know.
And you were having fun. Which
Oh, we
was
had
the main
fun,
point.
and I still remember it as like it was last year, you know.
Now, was this around the time? I know that he, for a little while, dated Jeanette Lee,
Oh, no,
Black Widow.
that wasn't for 20 more years.
Oh, I see. Okay.
This would have been a
Yeah.
mid-70s, late 70s.
Yeah.
And I don't think he was with her till about 2000.
Yeah.
You know.
And by the way, that we mentioned her, big wishes for her to continue her improvement with her struggle with cancer. Hopefully, she'll make a full recovery. Wouldn't that be great?
Would be.
Do you have any knowledge of her when she was coming up in New York City? Did you have any encounters or know of
No,
anything?
never in I never liked going to New York City.
Yeah.
So I didn't go there very often. But I remember her coming up to Bridgeport. There was a really nice pool room in Bridgeport. I think it was around 1990. And there were tournaments there. And I remember her coming up and playing then. And she would have been pretty young, but I don't know. But she already was a good player. You know.
Now, how about some of the then young guns in the city? I know that they launched out a little bit in Connecticut, like Frankie Hernandez, Tony Robles, and of course the big one would be George Ginky Sansucci.
Well, Ginky was a champion.
Yeah.
And you knew he would be. He started coming up here. He would take the train into New Haven. I think he'd stop in Bridgeport and pick up Robbie Sayers, because they would come into the pool room in New Haven,
Yeah.
which once again, this had to be around the early 90s. And Ginky, you knew was going to be good, because he would play every minute he was there. He would play me all afternoon if he could. And he didn't have to play gamble. He just wanted to play pool. And I mean, he had so much drive and desire, which most young people have. And he was a great player. And I think he won 4 world titles. You know.
Ask that one. Did you have any exposure to any of the older guys in New York City, like Johnny Irvolino, those kind of guys?
Well, Johnny Irvolino wasn't around New York City in his 70s or 80s. He went to Las Vegas, I think. So I didn't meet him probably till we're into the 90s. And I did get to play him a few times, you know. But, you know, I never knew him in his heyday, you know, in this, I guess would have been the 60s. But I'm trying to think of who else. At the time, there weren't a lot of great players in New York, till Ginky got. But I never liked going to New York. You always felt like you were going to get robbed when you walked out of the pool room, you know. And those guys were tough game makers in New York. That's why it was easier to go down south.
You often refer to Eddie O'Connell as your big mentor in pool. What is it about him that made him the supreme mentor for you?
Well, Eddie was rare. He was a top pool player, but he was also a top pool hustler. I mean, I saw him beat people that shouldn't even have known where the pool room was, and he'd hustle him. He'd look over and wink at me every now and then, and kind of like you, he only had one eye.
Thanks.
Thank you. But Eddie was he just was sharp. We'd go into a town. He was the first one to take me on the road where I won enough money to make it worthwhile. He would check the telephone exchange numbers, so people could ask you where you're staying, and he could say we're working at such and such a place. He would do all the research, and then he was he made money. Eddie believed the game should be won before you flip the coin. And he and I, if we ever had any issues at all, it was I would get in bad games once in a while because I want to play. I still love to play. Eddie never played. I don't remember seeing him hit a ball unless there was money involved. But in his defense, he had 4 kids, so he couldn't book losers.
Not just money involved, but he wanted it locked up before he started.
Oh, yeah, he didn't make many mistakes.
Yeah.
And as much as I thought of Eddie, somebody cautioned me early on, if you're with Eddie and he's on the phone and you don't know who he's talking to and a stranger comes in, don't bet on Eddie. He was treacherous, but he was one of my best friends from the pool world, and I assume I might have got some of that treachery also.
And he knew how to get that cash.
He always got the money, but that whole generation did, coming out of the 50s, 60s.
Yeah.
They were all sharp and
Well,
tough.
speaking of treacherous, so interestingly, I know from our conversations in the past, you had a little bit of a code yourself of people that you would stay away from. Why don't you expand on that a little bit?
Well, we would spend a lot of time in the South around military bases
Yeah.
because they all got paid on the 1st and 15th. I would never play servicemen for money at that point. I did years later. But if they weren't good players, I didn't bother them. Eddie didn't have any problem robbing soldiers or sailors. I did, maybe because I'd been in the service and I remember what it was like getting robbed by pool hustlers. I was in California in the 60s, and you had, Jay Swan, a great player. They'd all show up around Oceanside where I was stationed looking to rob, people like me. So when I got good at pool, I wouldn't do that. On the other hand, when Eddie would beat these guys, I had no trouble taking half. I just couldn't do it myself. And I always had trouble if somebody came in with their girlfriend or their wife. I didn't want to play them. I felt bad beating people in front of someone they cared about. I don't know why.
Yeah, you don't want to let too many people know that you have a heart there.
Well, I don't. It doesn't matter anymore.
That's true.
I'm a different person.